What if everything you learned about the Seminole people was only half the truth, and the missing half was hiding inside a single strand of DNA? Because when scientists finally opened that strand, they didn't find one story. They found two stories from two different continents, written by two different sexes, and they didn't agree with each other at all. Before we go further, if you love uncovering hidden history that textbooks never tell you, hit subscribe right now, tap the like button so this reaches more curious minds, and share this with someone who thinks they already know the full story. You will want to send them this one. Here is what most people are taught. The Seminole people were formed in Florida out of several groups pushed together by history. Creek towns from Georgia moved south as colonists took their land. Survivors of older Florida tribes, weakened by disease and war, joined them. And formerly enslaved Africans who escaped plantations in Georgia and Carolina built their own towns nearby and became part of this new nation too. Historians call this process ethnogenesis. It means a people forming itself on purpose, not by blood alone, but by choice, alliance, and shared survival. Even the name Seminole comes from a Spanish word meaning wild one or runaway. From the very beginning, this was a nation built by people who refused to accept the future that was being forced on them. That is the story almost everyone knows. It is true, but it is thin. It leaves out something that only became visible once scientists looked past the history books and into the cells of the people themselves. Think about how strange that is for a moment. For 200 years, the Seminole story was told mostly through documents. Treaties signed under pressure, letters written by generals, reports from soldiers who saw the Seminole as an enemy to be removed, not a people to be understood. Almost none of it came from the Seminole themselves, and almost none of it came from the enslaved Africans who joined them and fought beside them. History, in this case, was written mostly by the side that struggled to admit it never fully won. So when scientists finally found a way to ask the body itself what happened, instead of asking the paperwork left behind by outsiders, the answer was always going to be different. It was always going to be more complicated. What nobody expected was just how sharply that answer would split along the lines of sex, timeline, and continent, all folded into a people who had spent 2 centuries being summed up in a single sentence. In the 1990s, a team of researchers collected genetic material from members of the Seminole tribe of Florida. They were not looking for controversy. They were looking for patterns. Mitochondrial DNA, the kind passed only from mother to child, generation after generation, without ever mixing with the father's side. And separately, the Y-chromosome passed only from father to son, carrying its own unbroken thread through time. 2 different lines of ancestry running side by side through the same people, but never touching. What the researchers expected was a reasonably even mixture. If the Seminole Nation really was built from Creek towns, Florida survivors, and African families living side by side for generations, intermarrying, raising children together, fighting the same wars, you would expect the genetic record to look blended. A bit of everything, spread out fairly evenly, the way Ancestry usually looks after a few generations of contact between neighbors. That is not what they found. On the maternal side, the mitochondrial DNA, almost all of the lineages traced back to deep Indigenous American roots, the kind that go back thousands of years before any European ship reached this coastline. That part matched what everyone expected, but a small portion, close to 5%, traced back not to Europe, but to West Africa. And here's the detail that should stop you. Not one single maternal line in the entire sample traced back to Europe. Not one. After 3 centuries of Spanish, British, and American contact, soldiers, traders, settlers, captives, colonizers of every kind walking through Seminole territory for generation after generation, the maternal line shows 0 European ancestry. Now, flip to the paternal side, the Y-chromosome. The picture completely reverses. About 11% of the male lineages traced back to Europe, and on the African side, on the paternal line, there was almost nothing. Essentially, no standard African Y chromosome markers showed up at all. Read that again, because it is strange enough to deserve a second look. European fathers, but almost no African fathers. African mothers, but almost no European mothers. 2 separate ancestral stories layered into the same population, and they point in completely opposite directions. This is where the simple textbook version starts to strain under its own weight. A story that says several peoples merged into one nation does not explain why the merging looked like this. It does not explain why European ancestry shows up strongly in fathers and not at all in mothers. It does not explain why African ancestry shows up strongly in mothers and barely at all in fathers. Something more specific happened here. Something that a single sentence in a history book was never built to capture. So now there are 2 separate mysteries sitting side by side, and neither one explains the other. The first mystery. Why does a nation with 300 years of documented contact with European colonizers carry almost no European ancestry through its mothers, while carrying a Measurable amount through its fathers? The second mystery: why does the same nation, formed partly through alliance with communities of formerly enslaved Africans, intermarrying, fighting side by side in 3 separate wars against the United States, carry African ancestry almost only through its mothers, with barely a trace through its fathers? Let's look at the most obvious explanation first, because it is the one most people reach for immediately. European men, traders, soldiers, escaped workers, sometimes fathered children with Seminole women, while European women almost never entered Seminole communities, because colonial society rarely sent women into frontier contact the way it sent men. That would explain the European signal showing up strongly in fathers and barely at all in mothers. It is a reasonable explanation, but it only solves half the puzzle. It says nothing about why the African ancestry runs almost entirely through mothers instead of fathers. If anything, you would expect the opposite pattern for enslaved and formerly enslaved communities, where historical records often describe unions being forced onto women, far more than the other way around. So this explanation, on its own, leaves the biggest half of the mystery completely untouched. There is also a deeper problem with leaning too hard on this first explanation. It treats European men as if they were simply passing through, leaving a genetic trace almost by accident. But that is not quite how frontier contact worked. Many of these men lived among Seminole communities for years, sometimes decades. Traders who married into families, deserters who found refuge in Seminole towns, rather than facing punishment from their own armies. Escaped indentured servants who had every reason to disappear into a society that colonial authorities barely controlled. Their children grew up Seminole, spoke Seminole languages, and in many cases became respected members of their communities. So while the mechanism explains the biology, it does not explain the full human story sitting underneath the biology. And that gap is exactly why the second theory becomes necessary. If you're starting to feel that itch, the kind where you need to know how a puzzle like this gets solved, that's exactly the feeling this channel is built around. Smash that like button if your brain is doing the same thing mine did the first time I read this data. Drop a comment with your own theory before I tell you where the researchers landed. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the moment, because we're only halfway through this. The second explanation focuses on what actually happened between Seminole communities and the communities of escaped Africans who settled beside them. These African families were mostly Gullah people, escaping the brutal rice plantations of coastal Georgia and Carolina. When they reached Florida, many of them built their own fortified towns, sometimes right next to Seminole towns, sometimes practically inside them. Historical records describe African women in particular marrying into Seminole families, becoming mothers within Seminole communities, raising children who grew up fully Seminole. Meanwhile, Black Seminole men more often stayed connected to their own separate settlements, their own leadership, their own family lines, running in parallel rather than merging directly into the sampled Seminole lineages. If that pattern held true generation after generation, you would end up with exactly what the DNA shows. African mothers integrated into Seminole maternal lines. African fathers largely absent from the specific paternal lines that were sampled. It is a compelling explanation. It fits the historical record surprisingly well, but it still is not the complete answer, because it assumes a clean separation between two communities that history describes as constantly overlapping, fighting in the same wars, sheltering in the same towns, marrying across the same lines for more than a century. Clean separations rarely survive that much shared history intact. There's a third explanation, and it is the most uncomfortable one, because it is not really about who chose to marry whom. It is about who lived long enough to have children at all, and who did not. This is where the story stops being about culture and starts being about survival itself. Between 1817 and 1858, the United States fought 3 separate wars against the Seminole Nation. These were some of the longest and most expensive military conflicts in American history relative to the size of the population involved. And these wars were fought overwhelmingly by men. Seminole men and Black Seminole men who fought alongside them died in numbers that simply do not show up the same way in maternal lineages, because those lineages pass through daughters no matter which men a community loses in battle. A community can lose most of its fighting-age men, and its maternal DNA record will barely notice, because mothers and daughters carry that thread forward regardless. Then came forced removal. In the late 1830s, most of the Seminole Nation was forced west along a removal route that was every bit as brutal as the more famous Trail of Tears endured by the Cherokee. Death rates on that journey were severe, and they were not spread evenly. Some families, some lineages, were wiped out entirely along the way. Others, through luck or circumstance, made it through mostly intact. Whole family lines simply stopped, mid-story, on a route most people have never heard the name of. Picture what that actually meant on the ground. Entire towns forced to abandon homes they had built with their own hands, marched for hundreds of miles under armed guard, through heat, through hunger, through disease that spread faster in crowded, exhausted groups than it ever could in a stable village. Children did not survive the march. Elders did not survive the march. And every person who did not survive took an entire potential branch of the family tree with them, a branch that would never appear in any DNA sample taken more than a century and a half later because it simply stopped existing. Meanwhile, a smaller number of Seminole families, mostly in the deep swamps of southern Florida, refused removal entirely. They fought a third war rather than leave, and some of their descendants live in Florida to this day, having never signed a treaty of surrender. That refusal is also written into the DNA in the lineages that survived specifically because they never left. And separately from war, separately from removal, there's a quieter mechanism working in the background the entire time. European colonial expansion into the southeast was driven mostly by men, soldiers, traders, settlers, moving into new territory long before their families followed, if their families followed at all. That alone tilts the genetic record toward European fathers and away from European mothers, even before a single war is fought or a single forced march begins. None of these three forces on its own fully explains what the DNA shows, but stack them together, war, removal, and the simple demographics of colonial expansion, and the picture starts to make sense. This was never just a story about who the Seminole people chose to become. It is also a record of who violence and government policy decided would have descendants, and who would not. That is the real mechanism sitting underneath all of this. Not myth, not simple choice. Demography, shaped and enforced by war and forced removal, written permanently into the biology of the people who survived it. Nowhere does this cut deeper than in the story of the Black Seminoles, because their history sits right at the center of this asymmetry, and it is the part most often left out of the simple version of Seminole history that gets repeated over and over. Black Seminole descendants are people whose ancestors were enslaved Africans who escaped bondage and became fully integrated members of the Seminole Nation under very specific historical circumstances built on alliance, shared warfare, and mutual protection. In more recent decades, the tribal membership of these descendants has been challenged, in some cases using genetic testing as the deciding factor. Federal recognition, tribal enrollment, and generations of inherited belonging have come under scrutiny because of a DNA test that was never designed to measure what these communities actually were. A genetic test can tell you which lineage group a strand of mitochondrial DNA belongs to. It cannot tell you that a Black Seminole soldier fought and died defending Seminole towns during the Second Seminole War. It cannot tell you that Seminole and Black Seminole families lived together, governed together, and resisted forced removal together as one interlocking community for more than 100 years. The DNA only captures fragments of a story whose full shape was built through choice, through loyalty, through shared danger, not through biology alone. And treating one as a stand-in for the other has, for some descendants living today, meant the difference between belonging and exclusion from a nation their ancestors helped build and defend with their lives. Sit with that for a second, because it matters. The same genetic evidence that reveals a hidden, centuries-old demographic pattern has also, in present-day disputes over tribal identity, been used as though it could settle questions of belonging and citizenship that biology was simply never built to answer. A cell under a microscope cannot see loyalty. It cannot see a person standing beside their neighbors in a war they did not have to fight. It can only see fragments of ancestry, stripped of everything that made that ancestry mean something. This is exactly the kind of story that gets buried under simple summaries, which is why channels like this one exist. If this is opening your eyes a little wider, do 3 things right now before the video ends. So the algorithm knows this story matters. Subscribe so you don't miss the next hidden history we uncover. And share it with one person who still believes history fits neatly into a single sentence, because after this, you know it never really does. So why does any of this actually matter beyond the science itself, beyond the charts and the haplogroups and the percentages? Because the Seminole story quietly challenges an idea that most of us carry around without ever questioning it. The idea that a people is simply a bloodline. One clean thread you can trace backward to a single point of origin, a single ancestor, a single homeland. The genetic record says something very different. It says a people can be built deliberately by those who refuse to accept the futures that empire and slavery had already assigned them. It says the Seminole Nation was never one bloodline pretending to be unified. It was several bloodlines that chose unity anyway, politically, militarily, culturally. Even while war and policy were quietly, unevenly deciding which of those bloodlines would leave descendants behind and which would not. The DNA does not just tell us where the Seminole people came from. It tells us, with unusual and sometimes uncomfortable precision, what survival actually cost and exactly who paid that cost. Every strand of that mitochondrial DNA carrying a West African signature represents a woman who was taken from her home, crossed an ocean in chains, escaped bondage, and built a new life and a new identity for her children in defiance of everything that was supposed to happen to her instead. Every European Y-chromosome marker represents a story we will likely never fully know of a man who crossed into Seminole territory and left something behind that outlasted him by centuries. And every missing lineage, every line that should be there and is not, represents a person, a family, sometimes an entire community that did not survive long enough to be counted at all. War took some of them, the forced march west took others. Disease, hunger, and violence took the rest. Their absence from the genetic record is not nothing. It is its own kind of evidence, a silence that speaks just as clearly as anything that did survive. This is what makes the Seminole story so much bigger than a single tribe in Florida. It is a reminder that identity is never as simple as a single sentence, and it is never something a lab result alone can fully explain. It is built by people who choose each other again and again, through danger, through loss, through decades of shared struggle long before any scientist ever thinks to look for it in a strand of DNA. The Seminole Nation was not one people pretending to be many. It was many peoples who decided, deliberately and against enormous odds, to become one. And the deepest proof of that decision is not hiding in a history book. It survived quietly inside the cells of their descendants, waiting more than a century and a half to finally be read. If this story changed how you think about identity, history, or belonging, that is exactly why this channel exists. Hit subscribe, leave a like, and tell us in the comments which part of this story surprised you the most, because the next hidden history we uncover might be even harder to believe than this one.